Welcome to Making IT Work, Deep Creek Center's blog for IT professionals committed to using best practices to provide exceptional value for their business clients.
Hi, and welcome to the podcast. Today we're going to start talking about systems thinking, complex modeling, and basically how we approach thinking about different types of problems to try to come up with effective approaches for trying to solve them. So there's been a lot of research over many years in ways that we model and think about different kinds of problems. One of the more popular approaches to thinking about and organizing these types of ways of approaching different types of problems is called the Cynefin model. And it was created by a gentleman in IBM Global Services back in the late 1990s to help create a framework for thinking about different kinds of problems and what types of problem-solving approaches make the most sense in being able to address them. In the Cynefin model, we might begin with what we would think of as clear or obvious types of situations, where there are standard, typical ways of doing certain kinds of things. The problem that presents itself is very straightforward, and we want to be able to apply in some type of routine way a set of consistent practices for how we deal with it. So in these types of approaches, we want to be able to effectively categorize that this is one of those situations where we might apply some set of standard procedures and then be able to respond in ways to execute those procedures efficiently and effectively. So as a simple example, this might be how we establish some type of routine service request. Perhaps human resources has hired a new employee. And based on this, we want to be able to do certain provisioning for that employee. A laptop, access to certain software applications, provision of certain access rights. So this is clearly an endeavor that can lend itself to procedures and to application of best practices when it happens. It's a clear situation with a clearly delineated connection between the triggering problem and what we would need to do to solve the problem. As we work our way towards something that might be more complicated, again, we may have a predictable set of results we're trying to achieve, but the approaches that we might take might be a little differentiated in how we might best solve a particular problem. So in a good practice scenario, maybe we tap into other areas of expertise, and different types of experts may have slightly different recommendations on how we might proceed, with the intent still being to reach some type of very predictable objective, that there's some particular outcome we have clarity around that we want to be able to achieve. And in this case, perhaps more analysis is going to be required before we can come up with the most appropriate way to respond. But the response is still something that can be governed by some reusable practices that we determine over time. As we shift across to the left side of the Cynefin model, we start to work with unpredictable situations. In this particular case, maybe we're talking about the era of systems. And we talk about systems thinking. We're talking about highly interdependent, highly interactive, complex systems where there is not necessarily clear cause and effect. And if we try to treat complex problems as if they are obvious or complicated problems, we may end up finding ourselves in some type of game of whack-a-mole where we change one thing and it just pops up errors in some other place. We change how we're doing that, and then it pops up errors in yet some other portion of the approach. So in a complex problem situation, we want to be able to bring an experimental approach to the problem, to be able to probe and look at the different parts of the system, perhaps to isolate where we think our efforts might produce the most benefit, but to be prepared to respond and adapt our approach as we learn and as we then get more understanding about how the system works and how we might enable the system itself to produce better sets of outcomes. At the bottom left, we find ourselves in very chaotic situations where there is an emergency situation and where immediate action is required. We may not exactly know what our action will do, but doing something is required. So the building is on fire and I get a fire hydrant and I start fighting the fire. I suddenly discover that it's an electrical fire and I need to change my approach. But in that case, doing something first is imperative in order to be able to try to respond to the fire drill immediately in front of us. We might look at the open area in the middle of the diagram and consider that what we might call disorder. In a disorder situation, we don't know what kind of problem it is, whether we should treat it as some type of routine, obvious problem where we can establish reusable procedures to do it, whether it's a complicated problem where I could bring in experts to help us uncover certain good practices, whether it's a complex problem where there are multiple intervening variables and we want to try to isolate and experiment on different parts of it, or if it's a chaotic situation and immediate action is just required. Right? And the challenge for you as a manager is that you have a comfort zone. And your organization and your particular management style may have a particular, what I think of as a go-to move. Do we by default think about problems in one or the other particular way? So if we're used to working in highly standardized environments where there's a tremendous amount of rigor and lots of process, we may tend to look at almost all problems as being problems that are obvious problems that should have obviously definable procedures. That may or may not actually reflect what we really have. If we have a really complex problem, we may overcomplicate our ability to resolve it when, if the particular outcome and the connection between cause and effect is clearer, we might be better off treating it as a complicated or even obvious problem. So one of the things you want to be thinking about as a manager is to kind of check your assumptions about how you choose to approach certain kinds of unknown issues. Do you work the problem based on the symptoms, an unpredictable or more predictable result, something that kind of lends itself to routine procedures, or something that needs to be driven by more safe-to-fail experiments? Or do we find ourselves treating the problem based on our particular biases and preferences? We like to work with complicated problems, so if something happens, my usual go-to move is to bring in an expert or bring in a consultant, and they're supposed to come up with some way that I can magic the solution. It may not be that easy. Conversely, if it's an obvious problem, your own people probably have a complete understanding of what actually needs to happen, and bringing that expert in is only going to have the expert echoing what your own people are already telling you.
Thank you for joining us today. Deep Creek Center provides consulting and training for businesses around the world. For more information, visit deepcreekcenter.com.